Welcome to the Odyssey of a Former Fat Kid. I'm your host and former fat kid, Bryan Butler, and today I am joined by licensed clinical professional counselor Melody Knapp. Welcome, Melody. How are you doing today?
Hello, Brian. Thank you for having me as a guest to your podcast. Hi, everybody.
Great, great. So, as many of you know, my podcast isn't just about weight loss or things surrounding that, but like to take a holistic approach of addressing mental, physical, and spiritual health. And yeah, my previous episode, I spoke with actually no 2 episodes ago. I spoke with Ashanti, who's a counselor as well, and we had the opportunity to sit down with Melody today. And Melody has a variety of specialties, but I think in light of just a lot of what many have been experiencing in the country in recent years, that trauma would be a good topic to discuss, and it's actually an area of speciality for Melody as well. Melody, can you just tell us a bit about yourself? Whatever you feel comfortable sharing, how you got into counseling, and why trauma.
Yeah, well, a couple of reasons. The first is just the compassion in this field of trauma, and that flows from my own experience of my own trauma and just healing from it. And second is the calling from God to to comfort to those who are in any affliction. So those are my two main reasons why counseling and specifically trauma. When I became a Christian, um, I asked God what He wanted me to do in terms of ministry, and so from where I was pursuing at the time before I was a Christian, I was pursuing doing business or auditing or being in a corporate world, and that was my past experience. And so when I became a Christian, God has just turned my life around and it just felt like the calling to do counseling. So I started interviewing others who have been doing counseling or even social work. And so I asked them about their experience. But I didn't know anyone, um, no one have told me that I should pursue counseling. People have told me different fields that I should pursue, but not counseling. And then when I went to counseling, it was like I just felt this was it. Um, and I love what I do.
You mentioned like when you became a Christian, you asked God. Not long after, you asked God what He wanted you to do. Um, when did you become a Christian?
1999.
99. Okay. How did that take place for you?
Yeah, to make the my short story brief. So I came from, oh yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I had my own exposure to trauma, and so I came from an unhealthy family dynamics, I would say. And so I left home when I was still in high school, in senior high school. And and from there, I had to live a life where I had to take care of myself and my brother. And so it was very, very stressful transition for me as a young girl trying to um, be an adult and take care of my brother at the same time. Working full time, working two jobs, and also trying to pursue a college degree. And so there was a lot of various of stressful events that came my way during that time prior to having like a just an unhealthy family dynamic. Um, and so trauma, and we'll talk about trauma a little bit here. And so I've experienced probably, you know, cumulative of traumatic events during those times, and people were praying for me. People at work were praying for me, and so I think that was answered. And as someone, and I just finally listened to the gospel, and I accepted Him as my Lord and Savior. And from there, I just turned my life around. I've changed my education from business to counseling and changed my whole lifestyle um, to doing what I wanted to do, and as opposed to just focused on ministry and immerse myself to people who are also Christians and who are growing in their faith.
How did you get exposed to the gospel? You mentioned somebody was praying for you. Did someone share it with you? Did you like start reading the Bible? Was it a combination?
Yeah, it was a combination. During that time, my mom also was renewing her faith, and my brother started to also renew his faith as well. And he had a lot of friends who were Christians who would talk to me about God, about the gospel. And so I started hanging out with them. And then at work, I didn't realize until later when I became a Christian that they were two of my coworkers were praying for me. And so a lot of people were praying for me, and and then it's one of those things that where my eyes were opened, and I was finally listening to the gospel, and I realized that he was my savior. He was the one. He was the one who could save me from everything that I was running away from.
So your mom and your brother were renewing their faith. So they had some experience with Jesus and the Bible and church prior to, but what about
Mhm,
your father?
mhm. Yeah, my father was absent in my life. But he's Catholic, but he's been absent pretty much most of my life.
How are your, if you don't mind my asking, how are your mother and brother doing now?
So my mom and my brother are doing well. So they live in a different state than I do, and so occasionally I will, touch base with them on a weekly or every other week basis. But
As we were talking before, talking about doing an episode, and like trauma is obviously like been with us for as long as humanity has been around. But there seems to be a lot more discussion of it now. I guess a lot more awareness or acknowledgement of trauma in today's discourse as well. Um, what are like the different types of trauma that one can experience?
sure. So trauma is an exposure to like catastrophic, life-threatening, serious injury, physical or sexual violence. And this can be like human caused, such as domestic violence, natural cause, such as earthquakes, um, and also technological or biological cause, such as like the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are the different types that we can categorize what those catastrophic life-threatening events are. So I would say like there is a difference between a small T, like a large T trauma, which I have explained um, just now, and then a small T trauma. So a small T trauma is not as catastrophic as the large T trauma. They are still calamitous, distressful, and distressing event. And the exposure is, for instance, like life transitions, such as losing a job or interpersonal conflict. And so those are the difference that you can is that you, between the small T trauma and the large T trauma. If you ever heard that before.
Okay, so large T trauma, those life threatening, kind of like physical violence or natural disaster or like a threat from um, like a virus or a pandemic or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So those are large T trauma categories, and then the small T trauma are still really impactful, but like a loss of job or
Mm-hmm.
those types of things, kind of a sudden change to life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but an external change, so whether a job, a loss of a loved one, or
Mm-hmm.
something. Okay,
Sure.
okay. How? I guess what are some other examples of the small T trauma that people might not necessarily kind of categorize as trauma?
Um, that could be maybe medical condition, like cancer or aging, medical condition in terms like dementia, um, those things.
Gotcha. Okay, so trauma for the person, but
Divorce,
divorce.
yeah, or
Yeah,
divorce.
yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I guess even something like divorce, you have the couple that's involved, but then if
Hmm.
there are children, you have the children that are involved in the trauma that they experience.
Hmm.
You have extended family or
Hmm.
friends.
Hmm.
Okay. um, what are some of the symptoms that people
Mm.
might experience um, as a result of the trauma, especially if it's trauma that they haven't acknowledged? What are some symptoms that they might be experiencing?
Oh, they have not acknowledged. Well, I'll answer that question in a little bit. But the exhibiting symptoms, right? The exhibiting symptoms are like biological or physiological symptoms, such as like an elevated respiratory um, like rate, like anxiety or panic attacks, or GI issues like a reflux acid reflux disease. Um, psych, yeah, psychological um, um, symptoms could be like emotional lability, cognitive distortions, or destructive behaviors. Social conditions or factors could be like avoidance, isolation, and avoidant is mainly avoiding triggers that can resemble the traumatic event, or it's that reminds them of the traumatic event. And also spiritual factors. Sorry, and spiritual factor like existential or theological crisis or loss of faith.
So maybe an example of that would be um, you. I guess a faith example could be you're in a relatively safe environment for your faith, but then high schooler or something like that, go to college, or if you're in one city, with a lot of familiarity, you move to a new city with job, etc., and then the new environment isn't as um,
Hmm.
friendly to your faith. That could be categorized as a possible scenario that would induce trauma.
Sure. So in a small T trauma, so in a large T trauma where it's more catastrophic, these symptoms that I just mentioned are more prevalent. So for like a small T trauma, you symptoms are may just be emotional and cognitive, and may just more psychological, but it depends on the person. So these are the expression of emotions are dependent upon like various of like multiple factors. Like the small T trauma and large T trauma, the symptoms are very different. And of course, for catastrophic events, like symptoms are more severe and reoccurring. And so, but the expression of these emotions are dependent upon multiple factors. So one is like the genetic and environmental predisposition. So that is a factor, and those can be triggered by stressors, right? So And then pre-existing like experience, say that these if they have experienced prior trauma, or accumulated trauma. So, and to experience trauma again, can create more of an issue for them as opposed to someone who only experienced trauma for the very first time. And then perpetuating problems if they have a prior diagnosis or reoccurring mental health symptoms. So stressors would now, evoke those symptoms again. And then also just perceived threat and how a person perceived threats is based on a conditioned emotional response based on like past experience that develop over time, and then also the core beliefs of how they view themselves, others, and the world that's been developed over time. And also, another important factor is the protective factors. That is like how they manage or cope, and then how they perceive social support. So those are multiple factors that needs to be considered why someone is experiencing trauma very different than another person for the same traumatic event.
Yeah, it can be easy to try and reduce us down to um, levels that of simplicity that just don't apply and don't give us an accurate understanding. And one of the things that's been interesting as I've gotten older is like either
Yes.
whether talking with my siblings or talking with other folks, it's always fascinating to see how much overlap there can be with you and siblings and like your understanding and experience of the household
Mm-hmm.
that you grew up in, but then also the dramatic differences um, that exist as well. And you know,
Mm-hmm.
and just the reality that we're just all so
Mm-hmm.
different and
Yes. Mm-hmm.
perceiving similar situations differently and reacting to those situations differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very good reminder. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but obviously, there's wisdom in
Yeah.
avoiding scenarios that are really triggering to a previous traumatic event that someone has experienced. Um, but if someone is interested in learning to navigate it differently, so maybe that there's not the need for the same level of avoidance, or maybe even like some would describe it as like the event happened and you have the scars from it, but it no longer has the power over you to prevent you from being in that in similar environments. How do people go about getting to that point?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And this is a very common reaction to trauma, is avoidance, or even just for anything that's stressful. People avoid. And so I have the same similar, my own, that's how I deal with trauma myself when I avoid. And so avoidance has, you know, we're so complex. Um, Avoidant can also be a learned behavior from your family. So, um, so, and so it's hard to redirect that person to not avoid if it's already learned behavior because that is what they're influenced in. So that's one aspect that makes it very difficult. And second, um, they don't have any other way to redirect or cope other than avoid, right? And so those are the two major things. So when I go through this with my clients, with individuals, and is is trying to find their skill sets and their strengths, first, to build that resiliency and that threshold to what are those ways that they can actually do to overcome what it is that they're trying to alleviate or resolve within themselves. But the goal is to not avoid. So what does that mean to not avoid? So for instance, say that this is common, like um, if a person grows up, if a person is lives within the family who are, quote unquote, toxic or abusive, right? And they're trying to avoid that um, because it's creating some, a lot of symptoms for themselves. So there's a set of boundaries that they have to kind of walk through, and what that looks like on a day to day, on a week to week. What are those parameters that they need to not avoid their family, but at the same time setting those boundaries so that they are not, um, so that they are able to heal at the same time, but also not, um, but not avoid their family, their relationship with their family. But sometimes you have to actually avoid completely. Kind of depends if it's physical, right? If the family has physical, if there's physical violence within the family, there has to be a maybe a temporary or permanent separation. So that's an okay to avoid that situation, right? But if it's just emotional, or just an interpersonal conflict, there's a set of boundaries that they have to learn over time, and how to still have a relationship with that person or that family, um, and not get caught up with avoiding or just being or continue that the destructive dynamic or patterns of that um, within that relationship.
That's helpful. Yeah, because that's easily one of the more challenging aspects, and for some folks, you're like,
Hmm.
yeah, the ramifications of uh, constant avoidance can be tough to watch and navigate. But I guess having clear parameters, like you said, if there's physical violence and things like that, and even I guess if there's a significant level of like spiritual or emotional abuse as well, the need to separate yourself and
Hmm.
um, but figuring out how does someone figure out what appropriate boundaries are, because there's a lot of talk about boundaries now too, but sometimes the advice for
Hmm.
boundaries can just swing too far in the one direction or the other.
Yes.
So how I know boundaries are going to be specific to the person and the situation, but I think it's fair to say that there can be extremes, and so how does one kind of navigate setting appropriate boundaries? I guess we can be broad. So like for small t trauma,
Yes.
what are some
Hmm.
guidelines that can help? And then for big T trauma, I guess what are some guidelines that can help there as well when it's interpersonal?
For a small, well, in general, there's different types of boundaries. Yeah, I'm gonna go technical again here. Sorry about that. I'll try to explain it. So there are the physical boundary, right, that we all know about, um, where you know, in terms of space, um, between you and the other person, right? There's that physical boundary and touch, right? You don't touch a person, um, those, those kind of boundaries. And also another common one is material boundaries, where my stuff is not, and that's your stuff, my stuff. And when you take my stuff without permission, that's stealing, right? So those are like common boundaries that we are aware of. The One of the things that I talk about is first is the psychological and the emotional boundaries. So in terms of like whether it is a small T trauma or a large T trauma, is is learning your own psychological or emotional trauma, which means where you are comfortable and you're aware of what that is before you express those boundaries to others. So the psychological meaning and emotional is like my feelings are separate from the other person's emotions, and knowing the difference between those two and that they are not enmeshed in terms of like confused by like how I feel is how they feel is what you feel or vice versa. That can be confusing at times, right? Am I making sense so far? Okay. And so because those are important, so I call it the internal, like the our internal boundaries. If we understand that and are comfortable and are aware of it, and this also includes values as well, like spiritual, knowing your values, what you believe in, what's important to you. When you know what that is, then you are able to express it in a way that is with confidence, right? And without getting confused of what that is, right? Um, and so I walk through with individuals regarding these boundaries before they express these boundaries, and it takes time. And what's interesting is once they're comfortable with that boundaries are, they're able to express it. A lot of times we don't even talk about how what that looks like. And because once they know what it is from the inside, they're able to be able to express it and um, to express it to others and what those boundaries are.
A crucial part of determining boundaries is um, doing some internal work, if you will, or at least some internal work. I mean, some external work that you internalize. And so, for like, if you're knowing what you value and having those clear um, and being able to articulate those enables you to kind of help set some boundaries and with
Mhm.
intentionality as opposed to just being reactive.
Yes, 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 and so with that is also being consistent with your boundaries. That's an important factor as well. So not know because when you're not consistent with boundaries, then what you're showing to others is that can be very confusing. And also, yeah, it can be very confusing, and people really don't know what your boundaries are because they're not consistent.
So, like an example of that could be in one setting, one person makes a joke and it's funny, haha. But in another
Hmm.
setting, another person makes the same joke and you're offended by it. Um, or, but it's the same joke. and
Yeah,
so,
it's the same.
yeah.
Yes.
Or like with my wife and I, you're raising kids, and if you don't have
Hmm.
clear boundaries, that's going to be produce havoc for you and the kids.
Yes.
And or
Yes.
if you have boundaries but aren't consistent with them, that also produces havoc with you and the kids, and even a level of insecurity
Mm.
in the
Hmm.
children, specifically because they're like, I don't know, are you really in control? Are you not? Why? you know. Um,
Hmm.
okay.
Well, I say this in terms of consistency. Like, yeah. So people who do not respect boundaries will not like your boundaries, right? And so this is where the question is when a lot of times people don't want to set boundaries is because the person that they're trying to set boundaries don't like it, or they're reactive to your boundaries. And so in the beginning, um, that's why it's so important to be consistent. if you're consistent, even when they are reactive to your boundaries, you continue to be consistent because over time, they're going to stop being reactive. I had to do that with my family. I had to set some boundaries, and over time, not to, yeah. So, recently, actually, with my brother, I was setting some boundaries with my brother, and not to give any more details, but it took him like maybe years later and he realized that what I was doing was not to hurt him, but to set some really healthy parameters so that it doesn't escalate. And so and for him to acknowledge that without me asking for it was like, wow. So it was bearing fruit, right? So over time, like the people will you know, there are going to be some people who will realize what you're doing. Um, but people who don't know boundaries or don't respect boundaries, they won't like your boundaries. But being consistent with them will over time understand, it's like, okay, I understand what you're doing.
And even if some of the people don't accept your boundaries, it doesn't mean that you then lift your boundaries. Like
Yes,
you still need
yes,
to stick with
yes.
it. I guess without going into too much detail, I was at a retreat recently and saw some great examples of walking with others through difficulties and trauma. And I guess a term that's popular now is kind of like holding space. Um,
Mm, mm.
but still, just like the others, would describe that too as like the ministry of presence. You don't necessarily have to have the words to say, or even if you do have the words to say, it might not be the time to say them. And sometimes just being with someone
Mhm,
um, through the difficulties, but being present is really
mhm.
impactful. What does it look like to walk with someone well through um, some trauma that they've experienced?
Yeah, so three things. Um, and it depends also. Three things that applies to different phases of one's trauma journey. And there is the acute, intermediate, and um, so it's kind of, so in the beginning stages of their trauma, it is actually like Job's three friends. Like they were quiet, they were sitting, they were being present, they were, you know, that's a very important phase there. But it's also important also after certain amount of months or even years is to be able to hold and sit in being interested and showing interest in the process of their trauma because it differs. um, the process of trauma could be different from one week to the next. And so what happens to that person who experienced trauma, especially the large T trauma, um, they go through like various of experience. Um, and it can be one day they'll be okay, and then the other they're not. And so, and can look like that for even years. So, like listening and showing interest is very important. Don't preach, don't preach. Listen, and then also is validating, not make assumptions, but validating their experience. Um, and then, and the third is these two things, like listening, showing interest, and validating, um, is actually encouraging enough to the person. Um, so, I hear all because I do couples counseling and therapy, and I hear often, well, I just want to solve their issues. Why, or and this is what I say to them. You're actually solving the issue when you are being present and understanding. That in itself is solving the issue because you are helping to calm the situation down by showing the other person that you're with them. So and they laugh, or it's like, oh, that makes sense. Well, I need to do something. Well, you are doing something, all right. And then so I would turn it around. It's like, and I would say like, isn't it hard for you to just be still and listen and understand? It's like, yeah, that's hard. See, that's work. That's problem solving. So sometimes I'm having them see the logic to it, right? So from that, so that's encouraging. And then also by even being present and understanding what's going on with their situation, from that, then you will know what to do next and how you can support and help them. Because if you don't do those two things, you're gonna miss something.
Okay, so I think part of what I hear you saying is there's, I guess, an underlying aspect of it is in couples therapy or even with um, a friend who is going through some difficulties. The There's tremendous importance of listening and understanding and validating. And for anybody who's wondering, validation of their experience doesn't mean that, like, let's say there's a disagreement. It doesn't mean that you disagree. I mean, you agree with every aspect of their experience, but it is their experience, and you need to
Mm-hmm.
hear and understand that first. And if
Mm-hmm.
they don't feel heard and understood, then any further conversation is not really going to take place, and vice
Yes.
versa. You want to be heard and understood as well.
Yes.
Got
You know.
it. Hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hmm. And even if there's no conflict between you and that other person, being present and validating what they're experiencing um,
Mm-hmm.
is of tremendous importance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, even for the healing process, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. It's a lot of work. Um, it is a lot of work, and I think those who want to problem solve are skipping that aspect, and I get that. I do that too. I think we all do that. I think the underlying, not just the main, but it's that we're so busy and we're just moving one thing to the next, and we don't try to slow down and sit in to what's going on in front of us in our relationship with other people.
That just reminded me of the, I guess, yeah, the tendency can be to just to fix all the time, but the reality is that some
Mhm.
situations are beyond most situations are beyond our control to fix. Um, it's not our job to fix other people per se,
Mhm.
and it is
Mhm.
sometimes even if you have the
Yes.
solution,
Mhm.
um, it may not be your role to. I guess I don't want to say present the solution because
Mhm.
sometimes it is like if a person is needs help and they need a solution and you know the solution, then if they're willing to receive it, then you can provide it. But it's always good to check if if they want to receive it. um,
Well, one important aspect, as a counselor, we're kind of we're people are assume that we have to solve it. So, uh, and one thing is in our role, we have to make sure that we don't do that either. So, our focus is to cultivate resiliency, um, meaning where they have to actually, we could only guide and be um, a place where it's conducive for them to grow, right? So, like, and so we're not there to do it for them they have to do it themselves. So it's kind of like they have to lift those weights in order to build those muscles. I can't carry those things for you. And so to cultivate resilience is having them figure out and how to go about what they need to do to to recover, to heal, to restore what's lost. Right now, we do provide. I mean, I do provide psychoeducation and tools and stuff like that, but but we're not the ones who do those things for them.
Hmm. There be a risk of, when a counselor does cross that line, is there a risk of creating um, a dependency?
Um, there can be, but there's like various factors why there could be. That's not the only factor why when individuals have these dependency on their counselors. So, but that's one of them, but it's not the main.
Okay. So broadly speaking, the primary role of the counselor is to help navigate these whatever challenges they've come to you regarding, and to help equip them
Mhm.
um, to navigate and ideally what conquer, move past. I guess in some cases you can't always restore what's been lost, but you can help heal and move.
Mhm.
I don't even want to say move beyond, because for some people that's like, how do you move beyond that? But um, yeah, how would you describe that outcome? Yeah, how would you summarize? I mean, build resiliency. Is there more to it? How else would you categorize? I mean, characterize your role as a counselor in the life of the people who come to you for help?
Alleviating symptoms. By alleviating symptoms, they can work on other things, right? So, like if they are constantly experiencing anxiety, um, they can't work on, their some of their belief systems, their maladaptive core beliefs, or their relationships, um, right? So managing their physical symptoms and being able to cope, their some of their emotions, or being able to regulate their emotions is is primary, is important, and then they can work in in their trauma, uh, or and then from there, when they're able to cope and regulate their emotions, then we process the trauma and how to alleviate those other symptoms that's causing, um, that those other traumatic symptoms that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with me at the end of your day, and it's great to be able to talk with folks like you as well, and continue to destigmatize um, counseling and counselors, uh, because there's no shame in it, and it's incredibly um, beneficial and helpful to go seek
Yes.
guidance. Even before things get bad. We do it all the time with, job training and other stuff like
Mhm,
that. I don't have skills, or I don't have knowledge in these particular areas, so I go get trained so I
mhm,
can do a better job or perform better or show up better.
mhm.
And so, like, why not do the same thing with, our emotional and mental health and our relationships as well? So
Thank you again for having me. It was a pleasure. It was fun just chatting about these things. I can talk about this topic pretty much all day.
and for anyone who may be interested in working with Melody, we'll have contact information for her in the show notes. If you're in the Chicagoland area, definitely reach out. So thanks again, Melody, and until next time.